So I chose to do a cabinet memorandum on the currency situation in Berlin during the Berlin blockade. This memorandum was circulated to the cabinet by the British Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs, Ernest Bevin. And the reason I chose this specific cabinet memorandum is that it's kind of a response to the implementation of the Deutschmark, which was the currency that came out of the West German state. So the linking of the French, US, and British zones displayed a lot of coherence and strength, kind of as a Western front. It also produced a currency that was stronger than the Eastern mark, which was in the eastern sector of Germany. And this adoption of this currency influenced the various decisions that the Soviet Union made during 1948 and 1949 that ended up influencing a lot of the decisions that were made during the Cold War. So kind of a bit about Bevin and his role in this. So Bevin, he's a firm believer in Britain's world role and the promotion of the British Empire for positive reasons. He played an immense role as Foreign Secretary for Prime Minister Attlee, and he's the author of this cabinet memorandum. Bevin was a bleeding trade unionist who also possessed a lot of patriotism for Britain and how it earned to be right next to the United States as a world power. Bevin came from a working class family, which made him kind of skeptical of his senior officials, as he saw the Foreign Office as dominated mainly by aristocrats. But with time, he was kind of able to appreciate their knowledge and their expertise that they lent him, and vice versa for them. Bevin also remained incredibly skeptical of the Soviet Union and was very adamant about fighting communism. With the years leading up to the Berlin crisis and kind of the challenges of the Cold War, Bevin viewed the Soviets as motivated by their ambition to spread communism, pushing them with the likelihood of territorial expansion. But Bevin also understood that there's a necessity of bringing the United States kind of into this because after World War II, Britain's economy was really poor. So kind of going into a little bit of background, I kind of like to think of this as like, it's really easy to think about historical events kind of as they appeared alone on like a timeline, but it kind of helps me to like look backwards a little bit and then go forwards. So kind of backwards onto the Potsdam Conference. So super significant to the Berlin crisis because this is where the big three kind of made the decision to partition Germany and Berlin following Germany's unconditional surrender. So May 8th, 1945, Germany was placed under the four-power control of the Soviet Union, United States, United Kingdom, and France. So in theory, this kind of partitioning, which we learned is really something that the United Kingdom likes to do, this partitioning of Germany would allow for Germany's economy to rebuild after the war had kind of depleted it. And in accordance with the Potsdam Agreements, Germany was intended to be governed as one single economic unit by the four-power collaboration through the Allied Control Council. This way of governance was not actualized at all, and the powers that occupied portions of Germany kind of imposed their own social, political, and economic systems, which would cause a lot of difficulties when trying to govern as a four-power control separately but together. And Britain struggled immensely because Germany was not the only country whose economy was kind of decimated by the war. I've included this map just kind of for a little bit of context into the way that the zones were split up in Germany. It's also going to provide some context for the West German state and where the blockade's going to occur when the three Western powers kind of combine. And this also has a lot to do with the implementation of the new currency. You can kind of get a physical representation of that. So kind of into the creation of the West German state, the Soviet Union, a little background on that. The Soviet Union saw itself as incredibly entitled to reparations from Germany, just due mainly to a lot of the damage that was caused to their population during the war. And these reparations seemed plausible in the beginning, but they proved to be really destructive as the Soviets overtook German factories and their production. In addition to these seizures, the Soviet zone, I can kind of go up a little bit again, occupied the areas where German agriculture was located. And an agreement that was made between the Soviets was that and the other zones was that they needed to supply foodstuffs to the remainder of Germany in return for a portion of the reparations from the Western zone. And kind of without this Soviet contribution, Britain was unable to produce any more than 40% of its food requirements. and this is a quote I found, which I thought was really interesting. It says the British zone was only capable of producing 40% of its food requirements. And given the perilous state of the British economy, not to mention the unpopular feelings towards the German nation, Britain strongly resented having to expand its scarce dollar resources at a time of food rationing at home on feeding its populous zone in Germany. I just thought that was really interesting. And kind of the lack of resources provided by the Soviet occupied zone was the first of many disagreements on kind of how to occupy Germany. And prior to the full combining of the zones, the British and the US zone merged in hopes to help Germany economically, and this was referred to as Bizonia. And then it was the official London Agreement between France, Britain, and the US that created the official West German state in June of 1948. Also, this created the Deutschmark, which would in effect would weaken the East German currency, which I think was one of what I found as the biggest turning point in this conflict. So I identified the push for a unified currency in the West German state as the defining moment in the scope of the Berlin crisis, as well as kind of to come the Cold War. So Bevin kind of identified the Soviet Union earlier as being driven by ambition to spread communism, but I kind of thought based on their sequence of decisions, ultimately culminating in the blockade, that fear was driving a lot of their decisions. And the Soviet Union was under the assumption that these unifying zones and the creation of the Deutschmark would promote future Western aggression. So it was kind of therefore out of what I consider fear, they begin to isolate Germany and explicitly disobey the various agreements made during the Potsdam Conference. I've included just this clip of a newspaper article. This is from June 24th, 1948, which is the day that the blockade was put into effect. I thought it was interesting because it explains explicitly how West Germany will not be able to supply enough electricity, and the only rail line that was allowed through the Russian zone for coal and food has been shut down. So I thought that was really interesting. I also just want to note that Bevin remained incredibly adamant about his stance on facing the Soviet Union as well as implementing the Deutschmark, regardless of the threat of blockade. And Bevin understood how grave a decision this was. He said, and I'm quote, "The future of Germany, the future of Western Europe, and the future of the precarious post-war order all hung in the balance." But yet Bevin remained steadfast and was really strong on the fact that the Western powers would not back down and yield to Soviet pressures. So kind of the Western response to this blockade, the Truman administration really didn't know how to respond exactly, which kind of made room for Bevin to kind of push through and promote his anti-communist thoughts. And they also kind of promoted the idea of supporting Berlin from the air. So just shortly after the blockade began, the first transport aircraft arrived in Berlin at the US airhead at Tempelhof. So I also have a photo down below of Bevin visiting Tempelhof, which kind of goes along with his response. He was really unable to stray far from his initial motivations of maintaining Britain's prestige after the Second World War, as well as opposing the Soviet Union at all costs. He announced to the House of Commons just 6 days after the start of the blockade, saying, "We recognize that as a result of these decisions, a grave situation might arise. And should this situation arise, we shall ask the House to face it. His Majesty's government and the Western allies can see no alternative between surrender, and none of us can accept surrender." So I just thought it was super interesting. This photo is about just a few days before the airlift ends. Well, actually, it goes on for a bit longer, I think September 30th, just to make sure that Berlin can sustain themselves. But the blockade is lifted a few days after this photo was taken. So kind of into the currency situation in Berlin and the significance, this cabinet document is from November, so about halfway through. And this memorandum, as I said, was circulated to the cabinet from Ernest Bevin. And it kind of sheds some light on the difficulties of creating the West German state, which is interesting and something I hadn't really thought about because you see the overall airlift as a success, but you don't really see like the more minute details. So the blurb that I picked said, "The hardship and injustice caused by the currency situation, however, are regarded as the fault of the Western allies alone, and they are progressively dissipating the goodwill which we have built up by the airlift and by our resolute stand against the Russians. The position in the Western sectors this winter may well be very critical, and the universal and increasing resentment over the currency situation might prove the divisive factor which we would lose us Berlin." So Bevin's greatest fear at the onset of the German occupation was the ability of the Soviet Union to kind of push out the Western powers out of Berlin. And he really saw this currency issue as the way that they could do this, especially because it was seen as the fault of the Western powers for introducing the Deutschmark. In this memorandum, it's actually interesting. It provides several courses of action that can be taken, but it's really important to note Bevan's perspective. It's this perspective he's had the entire time throughout this entire conflict, and he's extremely concerned with the Soviet Union and making sure people continue to see the Soviet Union as the enemy. But he also cares about Britain's status, and he's inevitably tied to the success of the Western allies. Therefore, when he says the Berlin population will be prepared to put up with almost any hardship as long as it is directly attributable to the Russians, and the Western allies are demonstratively doing their best to overcome it. It had a lot to do with appearances, as well as I think the success of something that he was really adamant about. The next blurb I have is just, with the passage of time, it's been shown to possess increasingly serious economic drawbacks, and these have had such an effect on the political feeling of the inhabitants of the Western Berlin that we are in danger of losing on this account much of the goodwill that we have built up through our stand against the Russians and the maintenance of the airlift. So obviously the airlift plays a big role in this as well. So I just also want to point out that with the Western mark, it was equal to 4 Eastern marks, as well as the fact that to have Western marks in the Eastern sector, it was a penal crime. So it was really difficult to pay people their wages as well as accept Eastern marks in the Western zone because of the discrepancy in value, as well as the fact that the Western marks weren't really allowed in the Eastern zone. So kind of the overall impact, the blockade was lifted in May of 1949. The Western Allies had transported over 2 million tons of supplies into the West Berlin over the course of the 11 months. The Allied response to the Berlin blockade created the formation of NATO and the creation of the Federal Republic of Germany. But I also kind of just wanted to question the currency struggle and the easily changing popularity of the occupying nations, kind of depending on the issues like the disproportionate value of the East and West mark. And I was kind of thinking, like, was Berlin a strategic choice to stay there? Like, what was Bevan's motivations in staying there? Was it to kind of bump up British prestige or just have another Western win coming off of World War II? But I thought it was really interesting also that one source I found kind of said, should they have used Berlin to kind of lock off communism behind Churchill's Iron Curtain? So I think there's a lot of kind of interpretations to this.